Hey guys, welcome back to another question and answer time with Draper. And thank you all for your patience around the Canvas glitch where you all so carefully uploaded your questions. Hello, wonderful puppy dog. You're such a good dog. Yes, you are. Such a good girl. That you all uploaded your questions, and I appreciate that. And then Canvas glitched, and I couldn't access them. And so a big shout out to Josh who helped troubleshoot that. So I'm going to start reading through some of your questions. And again, guys, if you were here, it'd be a big group hug because I love the thoughtfulness of many of these questions, and a lot of them overlap. And I'd like to start today. We have so few of these videos left too. Like, we're getting to the end of these books. So let's start by getting in the mud and wrestling with Georges Romanes. So it looks like Georges Romanes in your text. I don't know actually how he pronounced his name. So, question 1. Romanes concludes that insects and other organisms behave on a behavioristic and mentalistic approach. Do non-human animals, do you think, I guess me personally, do I think that non-human animals are able to translate observed behavior into their consciousness? Okay, let me break this down a little bit more. So with this particular psychologist, he is arguing that organisms behave in a behavioristic and mentalistic approach. Behaviorist meaning that behavior is evoked by stimuli in the environment, that the environment causes behavior. And mentalistic meaning that organisms have a private internal life of their own consciousness. Where Romanes falls apart, and we'll get to this in a minute, is he doesn't bridge the two well at all. In fact, he almost like he acknowledges one and winks at it and says, yes, that's important, but that's not what we're doing, and then he rushes off in the direction of science, like actually observable behavior. So with that in mind, and so we're kind of trying to take this up from within Romanes' point of view, do I think that non-human animals are able to translate behavior into their consciousness? And the answer is yes and no, and sort of. Because if you're asking me, Matt, do animals have a mental life similar to a human's? And therefore, that's the link between their mental life and their behavior, then I'm going to say no. Animals don't seem to have a mental life or a consciousness the same way that human beings do. In fact, it seems like animals think differently than human beings do, and in different ways. So my puppy, one of my two dogs, was just sitting there hanging out with me for a minute, and they'll wander in and out as we discuss, or they usually do. And those dogs do not have a mental life in the way I do. For example, I tend to think in pictures and languages. I don't know what language my dogs think in, and I don't think it's a language I would recognize as a language, if a language at all. For example, there is this phenomenon we see amongst human beings called a theory of self. It seems to be, from a human point of view, written from a human consciousness, that self-awareness in the ways in which human beings are self-aware is a requirement to have a true or full or sophisticated consciousness. And it seems to researchers that only human beings have a theory of self and a sense of self, meaning that a baby who is seeing its reflection in a mirror and is playing is putting together slowly, well, not slowly, babies seem to figure it out pretty quickly, that the image in the mirror is them. It doesn't take them years and years and years of playing in front of a mirror to figure out that that's their reflection. They seem to do it quite quickly. So therefore they have a sense or theory of self, and they begin to have a theory of self in relation to and apart from other people. So babies can begin, like toddlers can begin to identify how they feel. I'm sad, I hurt, right? They can begin to identify personal feeling states after a while. Now, before they identify separateness between others, some toddlers, if they're hurting, they presume everybody around them is hurting, and then quite quickly, and again, it doesn't take years and years, like decades, instead it usually takes a year or two where they begin to distinguish their feeling states from the feeling states of other people, okay? So that distinguishes them from others. which means that a human consciousness is an individualized consciousness. The way we take up our theory of self tends to emphasize more separateness from other beings than it is being a part of a hive mind where we're like reading each other's minds, we're all thinking the same thoughts. So, do I think that non-human animals are able to translate observable behavior into their consciousness? The answer is yes, but not in the same way that we do necessarily. Like when we have a dog observe another dog solving a problem, and it's a novel problem to the observing dog is able to solve the problem much quicker when put in the problem scenario. So if there's a problem on how to get the kibble that will be dropped if the dog tugs a rope in a particular direction, then a dog who is familiar with that tugs the rope and the kibble falls and they get the kibble. Now, other dogs watching that are now much more likely to tug the rope than dogs who don't observe. Not to say that all dogs do tug the rope and some dogs can't figure it out, but many can. That is a link between what they observe and their behavior. And this is part of where Romanes is coming from, that organisms seem to be able to translate others' behavior into their own, and therefore there must be something going on with them that is the translator of observed behavior into overt behavior. So when it comes to theory of mind, though, theory of consciousness, it was an interesting series of studies where they took to task the notion that dogs do not have a theory of mind, that dogs cannot recognize themselves or have a sense of self-identity. And sure enough, every test that people had done for many years, dogs came up blissfully unself-aware that they are not sentient entities. Now, I'm not going to argue that dogs are sentient in the same way humans are by citing the study. Instead, by changing the parameters of the study, i.e. emphasizing scent rather than sight, because all the other studies had been on sight, the dogs do tend to demonstrate a sense of self-awareness. What is their scent and what isn't? What's going on with them when they place that scent? Now, are dogs thinking in words like I'm speaking now? No, they don't. How dogs think, I don't know. There is evidence that dogs do have an approximate sense or even an acute sense of self if measured through sense of smell rather than sense of sight. So, do non-human animals translate behavior into their consciousness? Maybe. What they do tend to do more often than not is translate observable behavior into their own observable behavior. I don't have any evidence that dogs sit and ponder and reflect upon that which they've observed. Like if my dogs are snuggled up on the couch and one of them appears to have what seems to be a thoughtful expression, that might just be a projection on my part. I don't know what's actually going on in the dog's head. And when I ask my dog, hey Boo, what's going on? What are you thinking? She just lays her head in my lap and doesn't say anything. I have no idea what's going on there. So animals do seem to be able to translate behavior into behavior, but I don't know about behavior into consciousness. Because dogs have a theory of self, then that may imply a memory and therefore a mentalistic event. So, can we discuss George Romanes and his theories and philosophies? Yes, that's what we're doing. The textbook labels Romanes as a behaviorist, and he would only accept observable behavior as evidence for psychological functions. If he is so interested in studying psychological functions, does that mean that he doesn't think that we are just moist robots? Does he think that our psychological processes can cause behavior? It just wasn't clear to me. Oh, I feel you. Oh, I feel you deep. Okay. So with Romanes is attempting to psychologically have his cake and eat it too. It seems like you're with me that he seems to contradict himself a little bit. His task, his project does not necessarily succeed. So Romanes is arguing against some of the radical materialists who are starting to epiphenomenalize the mind. Okay, if you remember that big fancy word epiphenomena or epiphenomenal or epiphenomenalize, that means that what you're observing isn't what's really going on. Epi means apart from, phenomena meaning the experience, right? And so materialists tend to epiphenomenalize away our consciousness. In an earlier unit, we talked about some modern cognitive psychologists, and I evoked Dan Dennett, whose research is very interesting, where he epiphenomenalizes consciousness, and he says that consciousness is beside the point. That's not what really is going on. What's really going on are these brain activations. Consciousness is just fictoplasm. It's a fiction that happens. It's not reality. And so Romanes is actually arguing against that point of view. And of course, he's well before Dan Dennett. So by arguing that we have a conscious mind and that we are sure of the contents in our mind, he wants to distinguish that as that is where the surety of mind ends. That my mind is the only mind I can ever be aware of. I can only be aware of the behavior of others. Now, I can take for granted or even assert that they have minds, but the contents of their minds will remain mysterious to me, absent behavior. And so one of the things that he is also trying to do is he is also trying to limit inference. So inference is, because when you're out with that girl, you did A, B, and C, I can infer that your gender and sex values are as follows. And he says you can't infer. You can only make claims based on the data, okay? So he's really trying to humble and limit the extent and types of claims we can make based on the behavioral observations we make of others. So if, for example, I'm watching you on a date and you pick up your phone 23 times during the date, and your date has their phone put away and they don't look at their phone at all. However, every time you look at your phone, they look away. I could infer that you are not interested in the person that you are dating. I could infer that you are a rude person, and I can infer they're a better person or a better date by trying not to stare at their phone through the whole day, right? You see how that inference could be way off? It could be there's a crisis going on, that you're checking your phone every minute because you're wondering what's going on with your pops. You can't visit him in the hospital because he's got an infectious disease or they're afraid you do, but you're sitting there double checking all the time, and my inference is false. And so what Romanes is trying to do is he's trying to say, yes, you can be sure of the contents of your own mind, but you can't be sure of the contents of others. All you can do is measure their behavior. You picked up your phone and looked at it 23 times during the date. The date did not pick up her phone and observe it. And so the only time we can begin to make actual causal claims about behavior is when we set up the experiment, when we set up what's going on. I can infer what's going on in your mental life. If I come to class and I say, okay, if you guys go to this particular pizza joint, everybody orders a small pizza, everybody will get an A on this next assignment. And all of you do that. And if I infer that you guys value A grades or that you like pizza or both, I can't actually make that inference, right? It could be 100,000 other reasons. All I can do is count the relationship between I said X, get pizza for extra credit, and Y, a whole bunch of people got pizza. That's the conclusion I can make. I can't say why a whole bunch of people went, only that they did. So it gets really confusing when you're reading his philosophy, because he acknowledges that you as the experimenter have a mental life, that you're the one who is setting up the experiment, you're the one doing the observation. At the same time, though, he's radically limiting the validity of inference you make based on your observations. He's greatly curtailing down the types of claims you can make on your data. Now, Romanes, one of the reasons why he's in this book and he's not in the Psychology 1010 textbooks, like it's usually in History and Systems when people get to know this guy's name, is he is one of the core thinkers in what we later called psychological validity. And one of the things that makes a study valid is when it does not claim beyond the data. And so Romanes we can thank for that, because he is trying to help us not make claims beyond the data that we have, that we need to rely on observation and only make claims based on what we observed, nothing more and nothing less. So that was very important to later behaviorists like John Watson, for example, that you guys either are reading about or will, and then even later still, the next generation of thinker, B.F. Skinner, the founder of operant conditioning. Well, he and Watson collaborated, but Skinner really made it flourish. So when it comes to understanding other people's minds, though, you need to understand what Romanes means by mind, right? You may have a mental life. I don't think he's a libertarian, though. So libertarian in psychology means something different than it means in politics. A libertarian in politics means get the government out of my life. Like a colleague of mine's a libertarian, and he says, what I want to see is happily married gay men run their pot farm while carrying their guns. Like it's this radical freedom of get the government out of my economic life, my drug life, my sex life, my firearm life, my free speech life, like just get the government out. So that's libertarian politically. Libertarian philosophically and psychologically means those who believe in free will, those who believe that there is a part of us that can cause our own behavior. And I don't think Romanes is a libertarian. When I'm looking at that, he seems to count as what is really actually real observable phenomenon. He seems to acknowledge, at least in my reading of him, is that he seems to acknowledge that we have a mental life. At the same time, though, he is careful to point out that what is really real is that which is directly observable. We can observe the contents of our own thoughts, but it's a different kind of observation than what we observe in the motor behaviors of other people. And so therefore that's where Romanes' perspective seems contradictory and very confusing, is we can observe, but the type of observation is different. So therefore, what does Romanes mean by that? And he doesn't clarify. And so he becomes this very important figure of don't claim beyond your data. All you can make claim about is that which you have directly observed. You can't infer to something you can't directly observe, which is mentation, right? Cognition. So therefore, and so he's a very important figure in that way. At the same time, though, his psychology is a little bit contradictory, self-contradictory, in a different way than, say, Freud's was later or Carl Rogers was later, that there's tension built in there. And I think it's important for us to go, okay, the phenomenon under observation Romanes isn't the same sort of thing, and he doesn't address or deal with that well, so it can create some frustration for us in reading him. Then again, maybe I'm wrong, and maybe it is all the same. Nope, I'm right. So, I don't know that we can actually directly observe the contents of other people's minds, Romain. Their behavior is not their mind. Because if it was just behavior, then we would not know that dogs... Well, back to the point. So there's a heading in the chapter, defining psychology, natural science, mental science, social science. Obviously psychology encompasses all of these sciences. Then why do we seek to separate them when they are all interrelated? If they must remain separated, which science then yields the best chance to help individuals lead the good life? Bro. Great question. So we have natural science, mental science, and social science. Let's break those down in terms of psychology. Natural science and psychology is where we see the biopsychologies, neuropsychology, psychopharmacology, behavioral neuroscience, etc. Those are the natural science. Mental sciences, that's cognitive psychology. Okay, that's psychology, motivation, and emotion, cognitive psychology classes, right? That's where you see those. Social science, these are your social psychology classes, your psychotherapy classes. These are psychologies in relation classes. So psychology encompasses all three of these. Yes, it does as an overarching field. What's delightful and frustrating is the way in which this field overarches but does not connect. So you go to a neuroscience conference, they're not talking about what the social psychologists are doing. You go to a social psychology conference, they're not talking about what the cognitive psychologists are doing. There are a few articles where thinkers try to bridge two of those together, and they're in the vast minority of these studies. In psychology, we're like an overarching label for 1,000 different disciplines. In fact, Robinson actually talks about it in this chapter, that psychology is just a label for these very different agendas and these very different processes and practices that are going on, and we just throw them all under the umbrella of psychology. That makes psychology very different than, say, biology. Yes, there are different kinds of biologies, but there is a deeper unity. I can teach a biology class that is epistemologically, ontologically coherent, such that the specializations of biology all grow out of that class. That's not necessarily true in psychology. I can teach an introductory psychology class, but the fundamental assumptions of that particular text are varied and mutually contradictory and exclusive to the subdomains between chapters. Developmental psychology is a different sort of animal than social psychology in many cases, which is a different sort of animal than cognitive psychology, which is a different sort of animal than therapeutic psychology, which is a different sort of animal than neuropsychology. So their fundamental assumptions don't jive. They don't share the same fundamental assumptions. It's almost like as you begin to research into psychology differently or more intensely, the more you are actually distancing yourself from the other fields of psychology. Like, I have a sister, for example, that I have a lot of sisters, but one of my sisters is a geneticist, genetic biologist. And she still has something very important to say, and she specializes in plant genomes, especially hybridizing drought-resistant crops. So she did amazing work with tomatoes and later amazing work with grapes, where she made these really tasty, very hardy tomato strains that could survive drought better and provide vitamin C in areas where people were dying of malnutrition. So that has a sad ending, even though she didn't do any gene splicing, because it was hybridized. There's a terror amongst neurotics in America about genetically modified organisms, GMO. You even see it on package, non-GMO. I like genetically modified organisms insofar as it will increase crop yields, insofar as it will increase our health and well-being. I'm down with GMO. But because of America's terror, then the importation of my sister's plants have now been curtailed, even though she didn't do any gene splicing. So because it's hybridizing in a particular way across species, then somebody believed it to be a GMO and it all fell apart, regardless. She can still have very interesting things to say about the biology of my dogs, right? That there are still the same fundamental underlying principles on how biology works that connect plant genetics to what I'm feeding my dogs, right? We don't see that in psychology. If I'm mastering neuropsychology, it doesn't make me a better therapist. If I'm measuring developmental psychology, it doesn't make me a better neuropsychologist, right? There's not a mutual increase in learning across these separate disciplines. So why do we seek to separate them? Okay, I don't know that anybody intends to. I think because they're actually different fields underneath the same umbrella, we're not seeking to, we're just caught up in that dynamic. It's something I challenge my students about, and I think we've talked about this before. When we look at the number of research articles read per year by psychology students, the number is high while they're in school. Those who go on a psychotherapy track, mental health counseling, marriage and family therapy, clinical social work, even clinical or counseling psychology, those who go that route, we find that the number of articles, like articles they read, empirical, peer-reviewed stuff, stays at a certain level. It's not hugely high, but it stays at a certain level. The second they graduate, if they're in one of the therapeutic professions, the number quickly dwindles to near zero, to like an average of referencing or looking at one peer-reviewed article a year. Like it goes to that low a number. In fact, I think it's less than. I think it's like 0.75 of an article a year on average. So therapists don't look at the empirical literature in psychology. Why not? Because they don't have an empirical field. I just heard 1,000 of my former professors scream out in horror and then were silenced, like I just nuked their planet from orbit. But that's really what it is. Psychotherapy is a qualitative, phenomenological endeavor. It relies on different kinds of experiences and makes different kind of truth claims than a neuropsychologist does. So a therapist isn't going to read neuropsychology articles because they're talking about a very different reality than the one that the psychotherapist inhabits. So it's not that somebody ever intended to separate them, but now they are kind of violently separated. Now there's ego and politics and money. Well, I guess there has been the entire time. Okay, we were in faculty meeting the other day, and a colleague of mine is a social psychologist. He's a really sharp guy, makes interesting claims, does interesting work, especially in very advanced statistics and how organizations, especially he specializes in helping not-for-profits gather data and use data in very sophisticated ways. And we were joking as faculty about how a lot of the studies that are impossible to replicate or fail replication all come out of social psychology. So we were just bagging on his field. And he turned bright red and said, as the social psychologist, he wasn't the only social psychologist, but he really went to bat for his field, you know what I mean? As though by really criticizing his field, we were criticizing him as a person. We weren't criticizing him as a person. He does brilliant work. But the field of social psychology is rife with peril in terms of validity, disproportionately so to other fields. Not to say every field in psychology is immune from accusations of invalidity. So they are interrelated, I guess, but not a lot. Like the question asks, well, why do we separate them if they're actually interrelated? Are they? Maybe, I think sometimes, ish. Maybe. Like if you get a doctorate degree in clinical psychology, you'll have to take classes, doctoral level classes in each one of the pillars, foundational pillars of the field of psychology. You'll have to take a developmental psychology class, a social psychology class, a neuropsychology class, et cetera, one in each of the basic domains of psychology. And there's a lot of political reasons why they want you to do that. They don't want you misidentifying yourself as a clinical social worker. You know, they want, oh, you're a psychologist, you got to think like a psychologist, be like a psychologist. And yet, these classes that I took did nothing in terms of helping me learn how to be a better therapist or learn from my clients about what they need or how to provide it. So I think, okay, I guess they're interrelated, but not much. So they remain separated because entire careers are built on them. And people are very harsh and possessive about them, like my colleague was about social psychology when we were questioning the validity of many of the studies of that field. So which science yields the best chance to help individuals live the good life? The reason why your question is so interesting and compelling is because what do you mean by the good life? I know I can wait for a response all day. You can't give me one because you're not here. But it's a very important question we can ponder. Do you mean it has the best chance to live the good life according to the way Frank Richardson in chapter 1 of your critical issues text talks about the good life? And the way he criticizes much of what we presume to be the good life and points out that maybe there are other ways of living the good life that could be better? Do you mean like chapter 2 where Blaine Fowers talks about an Aristotelian ethic when it comes to being a good person and living a good life that way with virtue? The alternative social psychology chapter where it's all about living in connection and being a co-being of being in the world with other people and alongside things in a very prosaic way. Like, what do you mean by the good life? And each one of these has a different understanding of what the good life is. So the therapeutic psychology, counseling clinical psychology, has a model of the good life that relies upon, as you guys read in your critical issues text, liberal individualism and radical relativism, meaning that you are free, you have free will, liberal, and you are an individual, meaning that you are not fundamentally connected to anyone else or to a world. You're not obligated to this world. This world isn't obligated to you. Therefore, you have free will to do whatever you want. At the same time, though, with relativism, because you're having a unique experience in this world that only you are experiencing, what you experience is relative to you and no one else shares that experience. Likewise, that applies morally, that your moral beliefs apply only to you and does not apply to anyone else. So what is the ultimate good life to a liberal individualist and radical relativist? And that is doing whatever pleases them in the way that pleases them that doesn't interfere with the way in which other people are seeking to please themselves. And so it's a very self-oriented, very self-focused, very selfish ethic that we have in much of clinical and counseling psychology. And so that's the good life, right? I live my life unto me, for me, and by me. Now, you guys have read several chapters that either tacitly or explicitly criticize that particular position. Tacitly, like the alternative social psychology chapter tacitly criticizes it, the whole monism chapter criticizes it, the alternative developmental psychology chapter criticizes this position. It's all of the alternatives that are criticizing, in a way, liberal individualism and radical relativism. So they posit a good life where we live in moral obligation to others. That if I am a father, I am now always already living in a world where I am obligated to take care of my children because my children are dependent upon me until they are no longer. And then I get to wonder about way in which a father of non-dependent children is still a father. Like a discourse going on amongst certain communities is that it's harder to parent an adult than it is to parent a child in some ways. And therefore, we live in a world where the world constitutes who and what we are, and we are also constituted in the world. That there is a real moral value a wife has to a husband and a husband to a wife and parents to children, etc. That's a part of our living in relation. It's different than the values of the field of mainstream psychotherapy. So, therefore, these alternative chapters, if you take up our lives as love matters, relationships matter, and they don't just matter to us personally because it pleases us, that we can actually sacrifice our own pleasedness in order to serve others and meet our moral obligation for others, then it is all the alternative chapters, not the mainstream chapters, that have your best life of doing that. Sorry, the best chance of helping you live that good life. If your good life is everything for me and everything's about me and I want what I want in a way that pleases me, well, then mainstream psychology theories like social psychology theory, some cognitive psychology theory, of course psychotherapy theory, much of psychotherapy theory would really help you do that. So again, it all depends on what you mean by the good life. Okay. So, another question. The chapter states, so Robinson, the author, states that both Greek and Roman law acknowledged conditions of insanity but that to be deemed insane, one had to qualify as less than human. As there is still a great stigma around the subject of mental illness, do you think that, to some degree, this deeming people as less than human, if mentally ill, can still be observed in society? Does rushing into diagnosing people and the medical model of mental illness play into this, and is there any way to remove from that? Okay, let me see if I can bring up my, because I jotted down some notes after reading your question, and I closed those notes out. Bear with me while I bring them up. So insert background music here. In fact, how about something by like Korn, but set to like instrumentals? Da 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 da. Okay. Can I find it? I may not be able to, and I may need to talk about it another day. Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry guys, I'm not seeing this now. I'm wasting your time. So, I don't know where my notes went. Right click on Word. Does it show me that? Oh, it was on a different computer. Okay. So, when it comes to, let's focus on Roman law. There are two words that are used, fanaticus and non corpus mentis. Fanaticus means, it's the root word for our word today, fanatic, fanatical. That there is something that drives us passionately to the point we are not in touch with all of our faculties. That there is a situation at hand that pulls a fanaticism out of me, that I act very overtly, violently, or criminally in the face of these particular feelings. So imagine you come home from work one day and you find your lover in flagrante delicto with one of your siblings. That kind of passionate overwhelm of feeling whether you grab granddaddy's 12 gauge off the wall and start administering high velocity lead poisoning, or you freak out and melt down into a puddle on the floor in tears, that's fanaticus, right? There's this fanatical response in your body, and you are not in touch with your cognitive faculties as well. You can't make rational or moral decisions. Then non corpus mentis is the decomposed or uncomposed mind. Non corpus, right? Not composed. Mentis, mind. That the mind is not composed. Think of somebody who is suffering a deteriorative condition, like predominantly negative symptoms of schizophrenia or dementia, that these people are not in their right mind or do not have a right mind. And so their mind is decomposed. In these cases, these people are seen as less than fully capable. Therefore, because their capacities to behave are greatly constrained, the amount of moral and legal culpability they have, meaning how morally guilty or legally guilty they are for these crimes, is different than somebody who has a fully composed mind, who is engaging in criminal activities, not because of passionate overwhelm in the case of fanaticus, or out of delusion and dementia in the case of non corpus mentis, but they deliberately and systematically do this illegal thing fully rationally. So those are some terms to keep in mind, and we still see those in our legal system today. Now, granted, I don't know that they teach non corpus mentis and fanaticus in law school. I'll have to ask my lawyer friends. The point is, though, is not guilty by reason of insanity is usually referring to fanaticus, sometimes to non corpus mentis. When not fit to stand trial, that is usually very much about non corpus mentis, right? That if somebody is so psychologically disintegrated that they can't even be a part of their own trial, right? They can't participate meaningfully in their own defense, then you can't try them for a crime. So these conditions of sanity required the Romans to define people as animalistic, like in the case of fanaticus, which is different than or less than human, or non corpus mentis, meaning less than fully functioning human. So if you mean less than human, I guess what you're also implying is less than fully functioning human, and that has very much happened, and it still happens today. As there is a great stigma around the subject of do you think that deeming people who are mentally ill as less than human can still be observed in our society? Everywhere. It's a lovely paradox that we haven't resolved as a society, and I don't see us engaging in discourses that would help us facilitate them. So, a couple of examples. 11 years ago, I first moved back to Utah. We were in Texas for years, Indiana for years, and then UVU offered me a position in the psychology program, and so we moved out here. And at the time, there was some controversy. No, it was after a year, so it's been about 10 years ago. There was some controversy because there is a commercial grade 25-bed homeless shelter there on Geneva Avenue, kind of across the street and up a little ways from UVU. And the community, the Orem community, was fighting tooth and nail because they didn't want those kind of people in their community. They don't want drug addicts, homeless, mentally ill people in their backyard. Won't anybody think of the children, right? It was going to the city council meeting was very disturbing because of the sheer number of very histrionic voices, very irrational voices about having a place for homeless people to shelter. And there weren't very many reasoned arguments fielded in that particular city council meeting. And by the way, it's still, I think the building has been sold. Like, the people who bought the building, wanted a not-for-profit, wanted to help, after 8 years just gave up, and the building is now something else. But they fought for 8 years to try to serve the homeless. So we have this dehumanizing that people who are homeless, mentally ill, drug addicted, that they're less than human, they're these horrible, violent, awful creatures that I don't want around, not in my backyard, right? And at the same time, though, knowing and associating people who are homeless, this is a great place to be homeless, and it's a terrible place to be homeless. It's a great place to be homeless in the sense that you can make a lot of money. It's a terrible place to be homeless in the sense of people actually caring for you personally. So, an example, one of our foster kids was a homeless kid from a town in Texas, and my sister took him in for a minute, and then when they moved, they didn't have space where they were moving to, and so this young man moved in with us. It wasn't that she threw the kid away, it's that they were planning to move, took him in, but the place they were moving to involved living with other people, and all the rooms were taken when they took him in, so it was acknowledged from the outset. So he lived with us for a while, and he didn't want to do school. He didn't want to get his GED, he didn't want to graduate from high school, he saw school as pointless. He wanted to get back to hustling because you can make a lot more slinging dope on the street than you can working at a minimum wage job at Wendy's. And he took it on faith, even though it stressed him out, that there's another way to be. You know, there's different risks you take when you're slinging burgers at Wendy's than you are dealing drugs on the street. And the risk-reward ratio is very different. So I told him, you can be successful, you can be secure. Like our house is a very quirky, weird house. We got it super cheap, but it's like almost 4,000 square feet. It's weird, it's cobbled together, but a lot of room. My wife and I drive comfortable cars. And I said, you know, look at what you have after a few years of hustling. You got nothing. You got a nice pair of Nikes and a nice hoodie, and that's it. Look what I got after 20 years of hustling. You know what I mean? Because everything's a hustle. Granted, mine doesn't get me arrested. And so he took it on faith. And for a few years, guys, he really tried. He really did. He worked on his GED. He got everything done but the math, and was close to getting math passed. He even was going to be a D-. He was going to do it. And working at Wendy's, etc. And then one day, very uncharacteristically, he came storming up to me and just very disrespectfully started yelling at me. You lied to me! You fucking lied to me! I'm like, I lied to you? I'm racking my brains. Did I tell him a fishtail that the fish I caught was this big, and when it was actuality this big? And I'm just racking my mind. I said, after he vented and ranted about how I'd betrayed him, how I'd fucked him over, and I'd lied to him, and just wasted his time for 3 years, he finally calmed down enough where he could tell me what had happened. So he worked at a Wendy's that was just off a major freeway. And a guy was holding up one of the signs, you know, homeless, please, anything will help. One of those little cardboard signs with words scrawled on it. And he was out begging for about 4 hours. And he comes into Wendy's and he piles up all the change and all the small bills he's got on the table. And as James brings this man's food out, the man looks at him and says, hey boy, how much you make per hour? And James told him it was minimum wage. And he goes, look at all this. Guy made over $400 in 4 hours. He made $100 an hour standing at that particular street corner. And so James felt massively betrayed. He had made a tiny fraction of that in the same amount of time. And by the way, I later learned that was an abnormally large amount of money that guy made for that particular practice. You know, usually you average about $30, sometimes $40 an hour, not $100 an hour. He happened to have a particular lucky day, which he didn't bother telling James. He made James believe that this was typical, that he goes from town to town and he fleeces the religious suckers, the people who want to believe that they're good Christians, into giving him cash by looking extra pathetic and sad, and then he spends his money on whatever the hell he wants to. And then he goes to the next town and does the same thing, and he has the cycle, and it takes him a year, and he goes across the western United States, makes a lot of money doing it. And not profitable, own a house, buy a car kind of money, but plenty of cash for food and drugs and girls and things like that. It's exactly what he wanted. So we lost him. And James was with us only for a couple more months after that, and when he left angry. Here's what's fun in this tragic story. The citizens of Springville, because it was just over here on 4th, filled this homeless man's pockets with cash. But if I tried to open a homeless shelter in this town, it would be a riot. And I bet you a lot of the same people who are giving this guy $5 so they can feel like good people are the same people that would come to city council meeting and fight tooth and nail to make sure I don't open up a homeless shelter here. So I love that schism relative to your question, because we do treat them as less than human. If I see a poor doggo starving on the street and there's a little milk bone dispenser there, I'll put in my quarter and give that doggo a milk bone. But will I let the doggo into my neighborhood, or heaven forbid into my house? Well, hell no, right? And that's the way we treat people, is with that same inhumanity. And by the way, I don't see the field of psychotherapy helping with that problem. We will identify the homeless as mentally ill and we'll treat them, but we don't do anything about treating the privileged and entitled people in their comfortable homes and say, you people are the problem. Okay? Like Russell Brand, for example, although I don't really enjoy his comic specials, I never laugh or even smile during them, I like some of the essays he's written. And he's a comedian, and he wrote about, you want to do a war on drugs? You really want to have a war on drugs? Have a war on trauma. Have a war on abuse. Have a war on poverty. He says that's where your war on drugs is, not arresting junkies and dealers. He says that doesn't get you anywhere. You need to actually wage war on that which causes drug use. And well, that relates to this particular scenario. We're not actually fighting homelessness in the way we could. And we in psychotherapy take up the homeless as a problem. We don't convict society. When was the last time you saw a psychologist on CNN going, y'all Americans fucked up. Y'all thinking that working hard equals success. How many Americans were rendered unemployed and bankrupt with the pandemic because the majority of Americans have to live paycheck to paycheck because life has gotten so expensive here as the very wealthy and powerful suck up a massively disproportionate amount of the cash out of the economy and into their overseas accounts, right? Trickle-down economics doesn't work, but we don't convict their conscience. We look at the homeless as a problem and we treat them with our therapeutic drugs and we treat them with our special programs. We don't go to the churches and schools and then teach this message. Like a message that I saw the other day is there were a few homeless guys in Center Street in Provo, not too far from the temple. It just happened to be located there, not that the temple had anything to do with this. And there were some people walking by, and I heard a couple tell their child was a boy about 8, hey, look, if you don't work hard and really stick to the principles, like obey the commandments and work hard and do well in school, you could end up like that guy. And what I thought was really neat is nobody said, how can you work hard and make a better world for that guy? We still treat them as less than human. That you could end up like that poor schlub, rather than what can we do for him? How could we work to make the world better for people like him and like you and I? Instead, we see him as the problem. So a lot of examples of how we treat mentally ill as second class. Or no, another example. If you are sufficiently mentally ill where you are adjudicated to be a threat to yourself or others, we can take all of your rights away. Meaning that you can be pink slipped, which in the mental health field means that you can be put in a hospital or put in treatment against your will. And so if you are seen to be a danger to yourself or others, that you can be pink slipped, right? We'll take away your human rights to self-organization and self-destination, take that away and instead put you over here. And that's the way in which we treat people less than human. And some of you say, well, there's very good ethical reasons why we do that. Yes. At the same point, though, if you take up humanity as self-origination and self-direction and we take that away from people, then we are treating them as less than human. I can't just walk down the street, grab somebody, and confine them against their will, right? It's against their rights because they're natural human rights. But if somebody is acting in a way that is harmful to themselves or others, then I can, because they no longer have those natural human rights because they're seen as an unnatural object. They're seen as, again, per your question, less than human. So does rushing into diagnosing people and the medical model of mental illness play into this? Yes, I've already given a couple of examples to this, and that is it singularizes and desystematizes many of these problems. So an observation that is commonly made in the abnormal psychology section of our research is that those suffering from paranoid schizophrenia, and paranoid schizophrenia used to mean people paranoid thinking everybody was after them. The way it's come to mean through the various political machinations and iterations of the diagnostic manuals is people with predominantly positive symptoms of schizophrenia. Now, positive symptoms does not mean good or comfortable or healthy. Positive means these are the symptoms the disease gives you, in particular delusions and hallucinations. Delusions, believing things are true that are demonstrably false, and hallucinations mean sensing things that aren't there, hearing voices, seeing things, smelling things, etc. that aren't there. So paranoid schizophrenia is a positive symptomological picture of this profound mental illness. And so those suffering from paranoid schizophrenia in our culture have often, almost not exclusively, but often suffer what's called ego dystonic schizophrenia. Ego dystonic means that the the ego, the sense of self, is in disharmony with or dissonant with the symptoms. So if I'm suffering from ego dystonic auditory hallucinations, then the voices I'm hearing are, you suck, you're terrible, you're bad, you're awful, you should kill yourself, right? That's ego dystonic auditory symptoms. In other cultures, though, they're more disproportionately likely to enjoy rather than suffer ego syntonic, meaning it synchronizes with it synthesizes or synergizes with, right, the ego, and they're more likely to hear hallucinations of, you're awesome, bro. You know what? You're so cool. See all these people around you? They're staring at you because you're awesome. In fact, you're so cool. All men want to be you, and all women want you. It's that amazing. You are like an archangel for God. You know what I mean? It's those kind of auditory hallucinations. So therefore, even something like schizophrenia is culturally contextualized in a way that the symptoms manifest differently across cultures. And what we do in psychology and in psychotherapy is we singularize it. We take it out of the cultural system and we look at it in a vacuum. We look at the symptoms in isolation, and then we diagnose the individual patient with an illness rather than looking at how society constitutes that particular illness in many ways. So, yeah, I think the field of psychotherapy is very much a problem. And believe me, it makes for very interesting discussions when you are a therapist, when you are a psychologist working in a clinic, and you have this very different point of view, where, like in clinical team meeting, my colleagues do this, this, and this about this client, what we need about the client, and I look up and say, I look at us in the clinic, what are we doing to help constitute this problem? And I also wonder what's going on in the client's immediate relationships. So if the client lives with mom, well, what's mom up to? What does that have to do with this client, this? What's going on with mom? What's going on with dad? What's going on with friends? Like if they're living with friends, like look at their behavior in relation to other people. And it's a very foreign way for therapists to think. And I've gotten a fair bit of pushback through the years. So is there any way to move away from that? Yeah, I just gave an example. If you're interested in the clinical professions, psychiatry, clinical counseling, psychology, clinical mental health counseling, clinical social work, marriage and family therapy, be the one who starts to look at how the system needs to change and move to intervene on and in the system. So how many psychotherapists go to city council and the answer is, I'm the only one I've ever seen there? For example, Springville tried to restrict the definition of family dwelling to the nuclear beaver cleaver style families, meaning husband, wife, kids, right? And there was actually a political motion afoot here in Springville to restrict the definition of single, which really would affect a lot of people's housing if it was affected this way. I wouldn't be able to get a mortgage if I were living with my husband, or if it was me and my kids and I don't have a spouse, but 3 of the kids aren't biologically mine, only 2 is because of the messy divorce and the stepkid situation. Yeah, like it would really negatively affect a lot of people, but no therapist showed up to city council meeting to advocate that the law not specify what single family dwelling is. There were a lot of economic vested interests wanting to contain that so they could start marketing homes in a particular way. But yeah, there was a few other voices, mostly this quirky word therapist and a few damn hippies who are arguing to the contrary. Now, thankfully, I think a few members of the city council saw the ways in which the people who would profit from the housing marketing were manipulating the political system. They took umbrage to that and refused to vote in favor. Not that they were in favor of what me and the damn hippies were saying, but they resented being manipulated. And so, thank goodness. But that gets to my point, right? How are we involved economically? How are we involved politically? How are we involved societally? So, for example, church doesn't fit me well. I don't fit in there. It's not designed or built for people like me. At the same time, though, I go because there are people there who need a hug. There are people there who need to hang out with somebody who doesn't share a message of shame or of judgment or of things like that, and instead shares a message of, I'm just glad to see you. You know what I mean? And likewise, I try to do that at school. I'm aware that as a university, I am profiting off of your debt, right? This nice room, I've got, my games are over here, my roommate's games are over here, that is possible because of the tuition dollars you guys pay and what little state subsidies UVU gets. The food in my mouth comes from your student loan debt. And so therefore I'm very motivated to very carefully prepare my classes to hopefully make this worth it, and I don't know that it ever can be. So how can you be a part of the solution and look at it systemically? How can you be a part of the change? And that, I think, would really help. I think more and more of us are starting to do that. Although, but we're getting a lot of pushback. The war is real, and the casualties are real. Sorry, I was just thinking of a homeless man I knew in Indiana who literally froze to death on the street. And yeah, the casualties in this war are very real. But we don't talk about those on CNN. We don't say, here are all the people who died for big oil in the Middle East in this war in Afghanistan or Iraq. We'll show those numbers of those who are fighting for our profits. But we don't show the numbers for those who are dying because of profit. Okay. Number 3. Is modern society infused with dualistic thought, or is it not so? The answer is yes, society. We live in a very dualistic society. Is it always and necessarily the case? No. We do live in a dualistic society with some exceptions. You notice, so I saw this really snarky tweet and I laughed. It was back during the COVID pandemic. And a young lady tweeted, she says, I'm just blown away that this pandemic even happened with all these middle-aged women with their healing crystals and essential oils. And I laughed. Dark humor. I loved it. So that is a response to the dualism, right? Now, granted, the crystal healers, essential oil people can also be dualistic, but often they're trying to push for a holism. They're trying to push for an acknowledgement that our bodies, our souls seem to be whole processes. And so that's part of what's going on. And I'm sorry, I kept you guys over time. I am terribly sorry. So thank you for letting me entertain you or bore you to tears for the past little while. I lost track of time. Thank you very much for these wonderful questions. I found them quite diverting.